Hello, today I'm reviewing the Rapid, the first mousepad from a brand new company in the scene, Coldclutch. This is a completely unique surface designed to be a smooth speed pad. It is also very budget friendly at only $20 for the L size I have here. These smooth speed surfaces aren't something that I do typically enjoy, but I can certainly appreciate what this pad does well, and I do think that it is a very solid option, especially when you consider the price. And just as a quick note before we get started, this piece of paper here isn't to cover up any faults. I need some extra light to enter my camera so it doesn't end up washing out the image. And also thank you to Coldclutch for sending this out for review. So to start off with the build quality, overall, it's pretty meh. The stitching is not very comfortable. It is very noticeably raised and you can definitely feel it on your arm. And it also has this additional fault of this one thread on the stitching, feeling a little bit sharp and digging into your arm at times. You can actually see the thread here on the macro image that they use on their website. It occurs right where the stitching is hemmed to the surface of the pad. It's just a little bit higher than both the stitching and the surface, and you can feel that the edges on these threads here are a little bit sharp. I was able to get used to it and now I don't notice as much, but I can still feel it when I'm making these large lateral movements. This thread just digs into my arm a little bit more than I would like. The stitching does feel very durable though, and I don't really have any concerns for long-term viability. It still seems pretty well made despite this design fault. And the logos here are also raised and do very slightly affect the glide. However, it isn't actually that much of an issue. I thought it would be much worse than it actually is in practice. This Coldclutch logo is still fairly small and it is so far off from the side that the actual issue you have when you're crossing over is you hitting the stitching instead of actually running over the logo. Surprisingly, I feel much more restricted by the horizontal size of this pad instead of the actual logo itself. I still didn't have any issues with the size personally because this is the only size that I would ever need for a pad to be, but I know that some people do like larger surfaces. So this may seem a little bit small because of how restrictive the stitching feels when you try to run it over. But of course I also have desk mat sizes for pretty cheap, so you shouldn't have any issues with these. Now moving on to the backing, it is the same pretty generic textured rubber backing that you see on almost all pads. This isn't the greatest implementation of the style of backing, and I do notice that it does move around pretty easily. When I apply some downward force, drifting is pretty slight, but I definitely do notice it moving around a little bit at the end of longer sessions. It is not the worst rubber backing I've ever used, but it is certainly not impressive. The pad is also very thin and light too, which is one of the things that contributes to the rubber backing not working as well. This thin and light build does make the surface of the pad feel pretty hard and unforgiving. There's very little give and you get almost no comfort from an inner sponge layer. I certainly prefer if it was a little bit squishier, but if you are someone that likes these very hard, very consistent feeling surfaces, then I think this could be good for you. It definitely has that solid feel. It being very thin and light also led to it being crinkled just a little bit in the packaging while it was shipped. You can see here that there is a very noticeable wavy pattern along this side of the pad. However, this still doesn't actually affect the glide at all because once again the pad is so thin and light that when you move your mouse over it, it just completely flattens out the experience and you don't actually notice any of these waves at all. It was even much worse when I first pulled it out of the package and I still didn't have any issues. So while this pad may not look like it, it basically performs the same as something that is completely flat. And this wavy pattern that you see is absolutely no issue. So while the entire package around this pad is still pretty mediocre, the surface itself does feel super solid. The weave is made out of a synthetic silk material. I don't know what actual silk feels like, I'm not that bougie, so I can't compare it to the real thing. But what I can say about this synthetic silk material is that it does have a very slightly plasticky feel to it. It certainly feels like a nylon-y oil-based product. This still isn't bad though because the surface is very smooth to the touch. You could actually see here in the corners that ends up reflecting the light off my desk lamp. The weave is that tight and that smoothed out that has this very reflective, shiny quality. So while this very smoothed out, slick feel is pretty comfortable, I do think that their claim of all-day comfort is kind of cap. This certainly isn't bad, but I think the very soft, more traditional cloth surfaces are more comfortable for me personally. Pads like the Eclipse and GPZ ones still feel much more comfortable for me, because of the very soft, almost fuzzy fabric feel to them. The Rapid in comparison has a very hard, plasticky feel to it. It is still super smooth so it doesn't irritate my skin whatsoever, but it still doesn't have that same plush cloth feeling that really gives that all-day comfort for me personally. So I will say that the comfort on the Rapid more so comes from the fact that it just doesn't irritate your skin, instead of being a particularly soft or inviting experience. But despite this plastic feel, the surface is still very high quality. It has a very tight weave and definitely feels like something unique. It just doesn't quite live up to what I think a silk surface would feel like. So all in all, the build quality isn't anything special, but when you do consider that this is only a $20 pad, you are definitely getting what you paid for. It is not a super premium experience, but you aren't paying anywhere near a premium price. And especially when you consider how high quality the actual surface feels, this is certainly a great value pad. It is definitely great to see Coldclutch attacking the low end with their first pad. Alright, so now onto what this pad actually feels like to use in-game. What absolutely most defines this pad is this very smooth, very quick glide. It definitely doesn't aim for that frictionless experience that you may expect, and there is some noticeable dynamic friction on these large movements. However, this totally smoothed out surface does give you a very glidey feeling during use, and it definitely seems like it picks up speed because of this. Therefore, you do get a glide that is fairly fast and on par with these hybrid type surfaces, like the Artisan Hien and its countless derivatives. But you do still retain a little bit of stopping power due to its slight dynamic friction. Of course, it still doesn't feel super controlled, but you do notice the pad helping you out just a little bit. On these large dynamic movements is also definitely where the silky feeling comes in. I didn't quite get this experience when just rubbing my hand across the surface, but when you actually put your mouse feet on top of it and start making these large swipes, I definitely see where the silk comes in and it feels extremely smooth. This glide is actually more satisfying than I thought it would be. It feels pretty solid. But one thing that I should notice before I move further is that there is a pretty noticeable X and Y difference on this pad. The X-axis is super smooth while the Y is a little bit grainy and higher friction in comparison. The actual friction difference isn't that noticeable and was very easy to adjust to, but I can still notice that these movements do feel a little bit different in use. You can actually see this XY difference on the macro image that I pulled up earlier. The weave is made in such a way that when you move along the X-axis in this direction here, you end up crossing over these very long blades, and you almost end up riding on top of these like waves, and you get a very smooth, very natural feeling glide. But then when you start to move in the Y direction this way, you end up crossing over much more of these little gaps, and you feel all this little extra graininess. I was able to get over this really easily and it stopped bothering me after just a couple of minutes, but it is something that you should be aware of, because it does slightly affect how this pad behaves. Pure horizontal movements are perfectly smooth. I think the smoothest I've ever felt on any non-Shidenkai pad. But the moment you integrate a little bit of Y-axis, it ends up reducing the smoothness ever so slightly. It is still of course a very smooth glide, but you can still notice a slight difference when you start to look for it. As well as buttery smooth feeling that you do get on these X-axis movements does feel very good and very premium, I do feel that ends up contributing to the mouse feeling a little bit floaty in these small interhand motions. It feels like the surface is so smooth and so slicked out that it's like I'm sliding the mouse around. It is almost too smooth and I get a very strange lack of responsiveness on these small motions. This ends up making it feel a little bit hard for me to correct my aim, even when I just want to make little tiny pixel motions on my desktop with 1600 dpi. It feels strangely difficult to move my mouse individual pixels, and it definitely does feel like it slides around a little bit too uncontrollably. I do feel that this makes my play a little bit less consistent on this pad. I definitely do have very good first shot accuracy because I do have a very nice, very premium feeling glide with a decent amount of stopping power. But when I actually slow down and calm down on my aim to correct and get more consistent results, I do feel that I have to try a little bit too hard. It is still very doable, and I have noticed myself getting a little bit sharper over time. But I do notice a little bit of extra texture does go a very long way to making these movements feel more effortless and adding more consistency to my play. For example, the spread of pads that I have here, the NPC 450, Artisan Hien, High Tiltu, and the extra pad Aqua Control Plus Black Galaxy Edition, all feel fairly similar in speed to the Coldclutch Rapid. But all these surfaces feel a little bit easier to make these small micro corrections on, because they all have different degrees of texture to them. They all feel much more responsive and much easier in these small interhand motions. The NPC 450 in particular has the same slippery, slidey feeling as the Rapid, because it is a synthetic Cordura surface. But this extra roughness and extra texture it has, I feel personally helps mitigate some of the slippery feeling. Even a pad that is totally smoothed out like the Artisan Leiden can still feel a little bit more responsive because it does have more of a typical cloth feel to it. It is very hard to get these smooth speed surfaces right, because you are riding a very fine line between a smoothed out cloth and a more slippery feeling synthetic surface. Now of course this is still all personal preference, and if you do like the feeling of microcorrection that you get on smooth speed pads, then the Coldclutch Rapid can absolutely feel great in all regards for you. But me personally, I highly value texture when pads have this little friction on small movements. So this isn't quite the type of surface that I personally enjoy for the style of aim. But one thing that I do really personally like on the surface, and what I feel is unanimously good about it, is that it feels really solid for tracking. The smooth, silky glide has a very effortless feeling to it. And that floaty feeling I was talking about earlier in small movements, I feel actually makes tracking feel a little bit more satisfying. When you're doing large angle tracking, it feels like your mouse is floating just above the surface, and you end up having a pretty unique experience for tracking on such a smoothed out surface. It definitely can get a little bit squirrely at times for me personally because I am used to more controlled surfaces, but the effortless feeling did allow me to track pretty well. And most importantly, this type of aim was just very fun on the surface. You were able to play to its strengths a lot and utilize its uniquely smooth surface. And also just one quick final note I want to make about the surface is that you can actually rotate it 90 degrees to get a different experience. In this orientation, the grainy feeling part of the glide ends up getting moved to the X-axis. I feel that this does actually end up adding a little bit of feedback to my micro-correction aim, and overall it did feel a little bit more sharp and more precise when I was using the pad like this. The vast majority of the correction aim you make will be in the completely horizontal direction, even in games with a lot of verticality. So this extra graininess and extra feedback does make a pretty big difference. I was also able to pretty quickly adapt to the Y feeling faster, so the pad is still extremely usable in this orientation. However, I do still feel that using the pad like this ends up watering it down a little bit. It definitely does lose some of that silky smooth glide, because the vast majority of motions that you make in all games will be horizontal, so the pad does feel a little bit less special. The super smooth, fast, silky feeling glide is the entire reason you get this pad in my opinion. So while I do think I performed a little bit better and a little bit more consistently in this orientation, I definitely did not enjoy the experience as much. And I certainly would recommend that people use this pad in its normal way. I still do think that it is worth trying out because it is a completely different experience, and it's kind of cool to see two completely different sides of one surface. Alright, so in conclusion, this pad is pretty solid, but you have to know what you want. You are getting a completely smooth experience that does lack a little bit of responsiveness, and it is still not a complete speed demon. It doesn't have that completely effortless, frictionless glide. But if you are someone that does want a totally smooth, quick surface, then this is a pretty easy recommendation to make, especially when you consider that it is only $20 for this size. It is so hard not to recommend this pad for people who like these types of surfaces because of that insane price point. It is absolutely a rock solid budget offering. Personally, I would actually love to see something like a Rapid Pro. I think that the surface is super solid, but it is held back by some of the more budget offerings like the stitching and backing. If this pad was a little bit thicker to add some extra comfort, and they were able to improve the stitching more in line to what the other companies are offering now, I think they would be able to make a super premium feeling experience that I think would be worth a slight price increase, because this certainly does feel like a budget pad, and I do personally enjoy something a little bit more premium feeling. Also, this pad should put Coldclutch on your radar. It is really cool to see a brand new company make their first product something unique like this. It is very obvious that they want to innovate and bring new products out, so I am certainly looking forward to what they come out with next. This surface isn't something that I do usually prefer, but I do think that Coldclutch is a company that is capable of making something that I would really like. So I will be keeping my eyes on them for the future, and I think you should too. If you want to get an idea about the types of surfaces I do enjoy, you can click on a video about my main pad, the Extend Control, right down here. And also if you are a speed pad fan and you absolutely want the highest quality option, you can also click on my video about the Sky Pad here. And if you did like the content, drop a sub. I would absolutely love to see you all in the next one.